What would you do if, at 19 years old, you were standing on a wagon road at dusk with $11 sewn into the hem of your only coat and nowhere on earth that would call itself your home? Her name was Verity Sutton, and on an October evening in 1887, she was cast out of the only house she had ever known by her father's brother, a man named Silas Pruitt, who told her plainly that a ranch could not feed a niece who would not agree to marry his business partner for the sake of a cattle contract. She had $11, a mother's locket, a canvas bag of clothes, and a stubbornness that had not yet found its use. 2 days later, in the dust-blown settlement of Sable Ridge, on the edge of the Dakota Badlands, she stood before an auctioneer's table and heard him call out, almost as a joke, $7 for a crumbling, forgotten trading post at the mouth of a dry coulee that no one had set foot in for 13 years. She raised her hand before she had time to be sensible about it. The men around her laughed. She paid her $7 and was handed a rusted key to a door that had not opened since a blizzard buried a man named Elias Thorne beneath his own roof in the winter of 1874. She did not know, as she walked the 2 miles out to that leaning building with the wind pulling at her skirt, that beneath its floorboards lay a secret that would not only save her, but would quietly, justly, restore an entire valley of people who had been slowly bled dry by a man who believed no one was left alive who remembered the truth. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Verity Sutton. If you have ever felt like the world wrote you off as worth nothing, we made this story for you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if stories like hers matter to you. Stay close and follow along with us, because we have many more like it coming. Verity had been raised on the Sutton Ranch some 40 miles east of Sable Ridge, in a house her father built board by board with his own hands the year before she was born, back when the Dakota prairie still felt, to him, like a country with room enough for a man's ambitions. Her mother, Constance, had come from Ohio with a trunk of books and a habit of teaching her daughter to read by lamplight long after a sensible person would have called it a waste of coal oil. It was her mother who taught her the value of ledgers, not the value of money exactly, but the value of writing things down so that truth could not be argued away later by whoever spoke loudest. Her mother kept the ranch accounts in a hand so neat it looked engraved, and she would let young Verity sit beside her at the kitchen table, tracing the columns with a small finger, learning that a number, once honestly written, held its shape forever, no matter who wished to change it. It was, Verity would later understand, the first education in a kind of justice, the justice of the written page, which does not lie, does not forget, and does not care whose name carries the most weight in town. Her father, Amos Sutton, was a quieter sort of teacher. He taught her the land itself, how to read a sky for hail before it broke, how to find a spring by watching where the antelope grazed at dusk, how to judge whether a piece of ground long left for dead might still, underneath its dust, hold something worth saving. He used to walk her out past the north fence to a stand of old cottonwoods and tell her that most people looked at broken things and saw only what they had lost, when the wiser thing was to look at broken things and ask what they had kept. It was a strange thing for a rancher to say, and she would not understand its full weight until many years later, standing in front of a padlocked door with $7 gone from her pocket. Her mother died of a fever when Verity was 14, and something in her father seemed to dim after that, like a lamp turned low to save the oil. He kept the ranch running out of habit and love for his daughter, more than out of any hunger for the cattle business itself, and when Silas Pruitt, his younger brother, a man who had drifted from mining camp to mining camp for a decade chasing silver that never quite came to him, arrived back in Dakota territory 2 years later with smooth talk and a business proposal. Amos welcomed him with the easy trust of a man who had never learned to suspect his own blood. Verity, even at 16, trusted him less. There was something in the way Silas looked at the rancher's books at its water rights, at the coulee land nobody else wanted, that reminded her of a man pricing cattle rather than a man coming home. She said nothing, because a girl her age saying such things about a grown man was rarely believed, and because her father, in his grief, wanted so badly for his brother's return to mean something good. She learned in those years to watch quietly, to remember exactly what was said and by whom, to keep her own private ledger in her mind the way her mother had kept one on paper, not from any plan of revenge, but simply because it was the only power a girl in her position had, the power of an accurate memory in a world that preferred convenient forgetting. Her father died of a lung sickness in the spring of 1887, worn down, the doctor said, by a hard winter and a harder grief that had never fully left him since her mother's passing. In the weeks after the burial, Verity watched Silas Pruitt transform from a guest in her father's house into its master with a speed that left her breathless. He produced papers, a partnership agreement he called it, signed years before in a moment of her father's trusting weakness, that gave him claim to half the ranch's cattle, and more troublingly, control of the ranch's water contract with the Sable Ridge Valley settlers, an arrangement her father had always kept fair and modest because he believed water was not a thing a man should grow rich from. Silas had other ideas. Within a month, he had raised the price the small homestead families paid to run their stock through Suttonland to reach the good water, and Verity watched neighbours she had known her whole life go quiet and careful around a man they used to call friend. When she objected, gently at first, and then less gently, Silas informed her that a ranch was no place for a girl who could not bring herself to be agreeable, and that his business partner, a hard-eyed cattle buyer named Otis Kane, had expressed an interest in her hand that would settle several matters at once, matters, he made clear, of money owed and favours traded, matters that had nothing to do with what Verity herself might want. When she refused, plainly and without apology, Silas did not argue. He simply told her, in the flat voice of a man closing a transaction, that the house was not big enough for a niece who would not be useful, and that she should take what she could carry and go. She did not cry in front of him. She waited until she was 2 miles down the road, out of sight of the house her father built, before she let herself do that. She had $11 her mother had once sewn into a coat lining for an emergency that had never, until now, seemed to arrive, a locket with her mother's picture, and a small canvas bag of clothes. She had, she told herself, walking into the wind with the Badlands rising pale and strange on the horizon, absolutely nothing else in the world. She did not yet understand that she also had, though she could not have named it that way, her mother's habit of trusting the written word and her father's strange faith that broken things kept more than they lost. Sable Ridge in October of 1887 was a town caught between what it had once hoped to be and what it feared it was becoming. It sat at the edge of the Badlands proper, where the gentle grass country gave way suddenly to a landscape of pale clay buttes and deep-cut coulees that looked, in the low autumn light, like the ribs of some enormous animal long since fallen and turned to stone. The town had grown up around a spring-fed creek and a stage route, and for a time it had prospered modestly, its homesteaders scratching out wheat and running small herds of cattle and sheep on land that was hard but honest. Verity arrived with almost nothing and found lodging for 2 nights in the back room of a widow's boarding house in exchange for mending, and it was on her second morning in town, wandering past the land office out of nothing more than a need to keep moving and not think too hard about her situation, that she heard the auctioneer's voice calling out over a small, indifferent crowd gathered for the county's periodic sale of abandoned or unclaimed properties. Most of the parcels went for a few dollars each, unwanted scraps of land with no water and no road worth the name. Then the auctioneer, a stout man named Grover Pell, who ran the land office with the tired good humour of someone who had seen every kind of foolishness Dakota Territory could produce, called out the last item on his list, the old Thorn trading post, out at the mouth of Flint Coulee. Structure standing, but derelict. 13 years vacant. Taxes owed and forfeit to the county. Opening bid, $1. He said it, Verity would later remember, the way a man says something he does not expect anyone to actually want. A few men chuckled. Someone in the back called out that the Badlands themselves would not have that place, on account of what had happened to Old Thorn, and there was a ripple of uneasy laughter and a few words traded too low for Verity to catch clearly. Though she heard the phrase snowed in, and the phrase never came out quite right spoken, with a certain grim relish that small towns reserve for their oldest ghost stories, Grover Pell pressed on, raising the bid $1 at a time more from habit than expectation, and Verity, standing at the back of the small crowd, with her whole fortune amounting to $11 and her whole future amounting to nothing at all, found herself doing an arithmetic that had very little to do with sense. A trading post, however broken, was walls and a roof. It was, whatever else it was, hers to fix or fail at, and no one could throw her out of a thing she owned outright with her own money, honestly paid. When the bid reached $6 and stalled, she heard her own voice, steadier than she felt, call out $7. The silence that followed was the kind that makes a person's ears ring. Grover Pell looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at a decision he suspects is not his to question, and then he brought his gavel down and pronounced the Thorn trading post and the 4 acres beneath it sold, to the young lady in the grey coat, for the sum of $7. Someone behind her murmured that it was money thrown into a coulee, and worse. But Verity did not turn around. She walked forward, paid her $7 into Grover Pell's ledger book, and received in exchange a small brass key, gone green with age, and a folded deed with her name written on it in fresh ink. The first document in the whole of her 19 years that belonged to her and to no one else. The walk out to the coulee took the better part of 2 hours, following a wagon track that grew fainter with every mile until it was little more than a suggestion pressed into the buffalo grass. The Badlands opened around her as she walked, the pale striped buttes catching the low sun in bands of ochre and rose and a strange soft grey, and she found, despite everything, that some old and stubborn part of her chest lifted a little at the size and silence of the country. Flint Coulee cut down through the land like a wound only half healed, and at its mouth, where the coulee walls fell away and a dry creek bed widened into a shallow basin, stood the trading post, a long, low structure of hewn logs and weathered plank additions, its roofline sway-backed, its single visible window boarded over, a rusted stovepipe leaning at a defeated angle against the sky. It looked, she thought, exactly like what it was, a thing 13 years abandoned, patient in the particular way that only empty buildings and old animals can be patient. The key turned with more resistance than rust alone should have caused, as though the lock itself were reluctant. And when the door finally gave way, it opened onto a room thick with the smell of dust and cold ash, and something else beneath it, faint and mineral, that she could not name. Shafts of late light came through the gaps in the boarded window and lit a slow, drifting fog of disturbed dust. And in that half-light, Verity saw a room that had been a trading counter once. Shelves along one wall still holding a scatter of rusted tins and a few brittle bolts of cloth eaten through by mice. A stove in the corner, a chair overturned as though someone had risen from it quickly and never come back to right it. She stood in the doorway a long moment before she made herself step inside, some old instinct telling her that a room left exactly as its owner had left it 13 years before was not simply an abandoned room, but a kind of sentence, unfinished. It took her the rest of that first day merely to make one corner of the place livable, sweeping, hauling out what had rotted beyond use, discovering with relief that the stove, though rusted, was sound, and that the roof, though sagging, was not yet failing. It was on the second morning, while she was prying up a section of warped flooring near the old counter that had buckled upward from years of damp, that her hand found a gap where the boards did not quite meet the joist beneath, and beneath that gap, wedged into a shallow cavity someone had clearly dug and lined with care, her fingers closed on the corner of something wrapped in oiled canvas. She drew it out into the light, with her heart beating in her throat, and unwrapped, layer by careful layer, a small iron strongbox, no larger than a Bible, its lid stamped with the faint worn initials E.T., locked and far heavier than its size alone could account for. She did not have a key that fit it, and it took her the better part of an hour with a cold chisel borrowed in her mind from her father's memory of how such things were done, working the hinges rather than the lock, before the lid finally gave. Inside, wrapped again in oiled cloth to keep the damp from ruining them, she found a leather-bound ledger book, its pages filled with the same careful, deliberate handwriting throughout, and beneath the ledger, nestled in a false bottom she almost missed, a cloth sack that clinked with a weight and a sound she recognized instantly from her father's strongbox at the ranch: coin. And beneath the coin, several small ingots of refined silver, dull with age but unmistakable. She sat on the floor of that ruined trading post for a long while, simply holding the ledger unopened in her lap, aware in some instinctive way that whatever this was, it was not a stranger's careless fortune waiting to be spent, but a story someone had gone to great trouble to preserve, and that she owed it the respect of being read properly before it was touched for any purpose at all. When she finally opened the ledger's first page, she found it was not, as she expected, a simple record of trades and goods. It began in Elias Thorne's own hand, dated the spring of 1873, as an account of the founding of Sable Ridge itself and of an arrangement made between the earliest homestead families and the trading post that stood, in those years, as the only reliable source of goods and credit for 40 miles in any direction. What Verity read over the following days, by lamplight in a room she was slowly, patiently making her own, was the record of a promise. Elias Thorne, it turned out, had been more than a trader. In the hard winter of 1873, when an early blizzard had trapped half a dozen homestead families without adequate stores, Thorne had extended credit and goods to every family that asked, keeping a careful accounting not of debts he intended to collect harshly, but of favours and hardships he meant to balance fairly over time, the way a man keeps books not to enrich himself, but to be certain no one is cheated, himself included. More significant still, the ledger recorded that in 1874. Anticipating that Sable Ridge would grow, and that its water, the same spring-fed creek that ran through the coulee and on into the valley, might one day become a thing men fought over, Thorne had used his own savings, together with contributions quietly pulled from 11 homestead families listed by name in his careful hand, to purchase outright from the Territorial Land Office the water rights to Flint Coulee Spring, the very spring that fed not only his own trading post, but the entire lower valley where the town of Sable Ridge would eventually take root. The arrangement, as Thorne recorded it in his own words, paraphrased faithfully by memory of its meaning rather than its exact language, was that the spring and its rights belonged not to him alone, but in trust to all the families who had contributed, to be shared equally and never sold to any single owner, so that no family in the valley would ever again be at the mercy of one man's goodwill or greed for something as essential as water. The deed itself, filed properly with the Territorial Land Office and duly recorded, was folded at the back of the ledger, brittle but legible, listing Thorne and 11 other names as joint and equal holders of the Flint Coulee water rights in perpetuity. Thorne had died that same winter, caught out checking his trap lines in a blizzard that came up faster than any man could outrun, and in the chaos and grief that followed, the ledger's final entries, in a different, shakier hand that Verity would later learn belonged to Thorne's young clerk, described a fire that took the land office's own copy of certain filings that winter, and a town too consumed by loss and hard weather to chase down what had or had not survived. The trading post had simply been abandoned, its contents left as if the town had silently agreed not to disturb a dead man's affairs, and over 13 years the story of the Flint Coulee Water Trust had faded first into rumour and then into nothing at all, remembered by no one still living who could say for certain what it had meant or that it had existed. Verity understood, reading this by lamplight with her hands unsteady on the brittle pages, that she was holding something far larger than a stranger's forgotten savings. She was holding proof, honestly recorded and legally filed, that the water flowing through Flint Coulee and down into the valley below, the very water that fed Sable Ridge's creek, and, she realized with a slow cold understanding, the very water that Silas Pruitt had been charging the valley's homestead families to access through Suttonland, belonged not to any rancher at all, but in trust to the descendants of the families Thorne had named. She recognized, among those 11 names, families she had grown up alongside, families now paying her uncle's inflated water tolls without knowing they held, buried in lore, though forgotten in memory, a rightful claim to the source itself. She did not act rashly. She spent the better part of 2 weeks first quietly repairing the trading post enough to live in properly, trading her mending skill and a portion of the coin she found for lumber and nails and goodwill in town, careful not to reveal the ledger's contents to anyone before she understood them fully herself, and careful, too, not to spend a cent of the silver until she was certain what honest use of it required. She rode into Sable Ridge and spoke quietly with Grover Pell at the land office, who, after some searching through dusty territorial records that had survived the old fire in duplicate at the county seat, confirmed with growing astonishment that the Flint Coulee water filing was indeed still valid in the eyes of the law, never formally dissolved, never transferred, simply forgotten. It was Grover Pell, in fact, who first warned her gently that raising this matter would not please everyone, since he had watched, same as anyone in town, how Silas Pruitt's water tolls had quietly enriched him at the Valley family's expense these past months, and a man grown comfortable on an arrangement rarely thanks the person who threatens to end it. Silas Pruitt did not learn of the ledger from Verity directly. He learned of it, as such things travel in small towns, through whispers that reached him within days of her visit to the land office, a rumour, garbled and half-formed, that the girl he had thrown off his ranch had found something out at the old Thorne place that concerned the water. He rode out to Flint Coulee himself on a grey afternoon in early November, and Verity, watching him come up the coulee track from the doorway of the trading post she had by then patched and swept and made into something resembling a home, felt no fear so much as a kind of grim clarity, the feeling of a long-delayed reckoning finally arriving on schedule. He did not bother with pleasantries. He told her plainly that whatever paper she thought she had found meant nothing, that water rights on Suttonland belonged to Suttonland regardless of what some dead trader had scribbled 13 years before, and that she would be wise, for her own good, to burn whatever she had found and go back to being nobody's trouble. When she told him, evenly, that the deed was filed with the Territorial Land Office and confirmed valid, and that the water rights had never belonged to the ranch at all, but to the Coulee Spring itself, held in trust for families whose names she could recite from memory, something in his face changed, in a way she recognized from childhood, the look of a man realizing that a debt he believed forgiven had in fact simply been waiting. He threatened her then more directly, told her that a girl alone at an abandoned outpost with a story like that could meet all manner of accident in country as empty as this, and that Otis Kane, his business partner, had men working for him who were not particular about how disputes got settled out here beyond the reach of any real law. Verity did not flinch, though her hands were cold. She told him that she had already left a full copy of the ledger's relevant pages, along with a signed statement from Grover Pell as to the deed's validity, with the county sheriff at the territorial seat 2 days' ride away, with instructions that it be opened and made public should anything happen to her or to the original document. It was, in truth, exactly what she had done. Riding out alone before dawn one morning on a borrowed horse to make certain that whatever came next, the truth could no longer simply be buried a second time. Silas left that day without another word, but Verity understood she had bought herself time, not safety. The weeks that followed tested her more than the loss of the ranch ever had. Silas and Otis Kane, working together, tried first to buy her silence outright, sending a man to offer her a sum of money that would have seemed a fortune to the girl who had arrived in Sable Ridge with $11, on the condition that she sign a paper renouncing any claim on the coulee and leave the territory for good. She refused. When money failed, they turned to pressure of a quieter, crueler kind, spreading word through town that the Sutton girl was unstable, grasping, dangerous with her wild claims about old dead men's paper, hoping to isolate her before she could rally the very families the ledger named. For a time it nearly worked. Several homestead families, frightened of Silas Pruitt's reach and unwilling to risk the little they had on the word of a 19-year-old girl and a mouldering ledger, kept their distance. It was an older widow named Hesper Voss, whose late husband's name Verity, found recorded among Thorne's original 11, who broke that silence first, riding out to the coulee alone to see the ledger with her own eyes, and who returned to town declaring plainly to anyone who would listen that she recognized her husband's own signature on the deed and that she would be damned, in her own blunt phrase, softened only slightly in the telling, before she let Silas Pruitt keep charging her for water her family had helped pay for 13 years before. Hesper's testimony turned the tide slowly but surely. One by one the other named families came forward, some quietly, some publicly, until what had been one girl's improbable claim became a valley's shared demand for what the law, however forgotten, had always said was rightfully theirs. Silas Pruitt, cornered, made one final attempt, riding to the territorial seat himself to argue before a land commissioner that the old filing was void through abandonment, that 13 years of silence amounted to a forfeiture of any claim, an argument that might have carried weight had Verity not already ensured that Grover Pell's sworn statement, the ledger's copied pages, and the testimony of Hesper Voss and 4 other named families were already sitting, properly filed, on the commissioner's desk, exactly as she had planned from that first uneasy visit to Silas at the coulee. The commissioner's ruling, delivered on a bright, cold morning in early December, with most of Sable Ridge crowded into the small territorial courthouse to hear it, was as simple and final as the deed itself. The Flint Coulee water rights were confirmed to have never lapsed, were declared held properly in trust for the 11 named families and their heirs, Verity Sutton included by virtue of her lawful ownership of the trading post and its recovered documents, and Silas Pruitt was ordered to cease all tolls collected on water access through Sutton land, with the commissioner noting dryly for the record that a man who profits for months from a right he does not hold may yet find himself owing a good deal more than he collected. Silas did not go to prison, for no law had been broken so cleanly as that, but the ruling stripped him of the water leverage that had made him powerful in the valley, and within the season, unable to hold the ranch profitably without it, and unwilling to face neighbors who now knew exactly what kind of man he had shown himself to be, he sold the Sutton Ranch and left Dakota Territory for good. His business partner Otis Kane not far behind him, the two of them chasing some other territory's ignorance the way men like that always eventually do. Verity did not take satisfaction in his ruin so much as a quiet, settled relief that the truth, once written honestly and kept safe, had done exactly what her mother always said the written word could do. It had held its shape, no matter who wished to argue it away. What Verity did with the silver and coin she found in Thorne's strongbox became, in its own way, as much a part of Sable Ridge's story as the water rights themselves. She did not keep it, not fully, and she did not need to. The water alone, restored to the families who held it in trust, was worth more to the valley than any coin could measure. Instead, following what she believed, rightly or not, was the spirit of Elias Thorne's own long-ago intentions. She used a portion of the silver to repair and reopen the trading post itself as a proper store and gathering place for the valley, stocked on credit terms as fair as Thorne's had once been, and she used the remainder, together with a modest sum from the sale of a few of her father's remaining cattle that Silas had not managed to claim, to dig a proper communal well and trough at the coulee's mouth, so that no family, however poor, would ever again have to depend on any single person's goodwill for water. The trading post's ledger, restored to legibility and displayed under glass on the very counter where it had once been hidden beneath the floor, became something of a local legend in its own right. The story of the trader who kept his promises even in death, and the girl who arrived with $7 and the stubbornness to honor them. And so it was that Verity Sutton, who had stood on a wagon road at 19 with $11 and nothing else in the world, came in time to be known throughout the Sable Ridge Valley, not as the niece Silas Pruitt had cast off, but as the keeper of Flint Coulee, the young woman who had looked at a forgotten, dreaded ruin that grown men laughed at for $7 and had seen in it. Exactly as her father once taught her beneath the old cottonwoods, not what had been lost, but what had been kept. She had lost a home, a family name's easy comfort, and every certainty she once took for granted, but what she found in their place was sturdier, a spring that would never again run dry for a single family's want of fairness. A valley of neighbors who trusted her the way they had once trusted a dead trader 13 years gone, and the quiet, hard-won knowledge that even the most overlooked, most abandoned thing in the world might be holding, patiently, in the dark beneath its floorboards, the exact restoration a whole community had been waiting for without knowing it. Thank you for spending this time with Verity's story and with us tonight. If something in her journey moved you, the courage of starting again with almost nothing, the quiet justice of the truth finally being heard, the reminder that overlooked things often hold more worth than anyone expects, we would be so grateful if you shared this video with someone who needs a little hope tonight. And if you haven't yet, please consider following or subscribing to our channel, because we bring stories just like this one of frontier women who rebuilt their lives from almost nothing every single week. We would love to know, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one of them. Until next time, stay close.